So Jonathan actually has a BS biology degree, majoring in human biology from De La Salle University in Dasmariñas, Cavite, and he has a master's degree in molecular biology and biotechnology, minoring in biochemistry from University of the Philippines, Los Baños. So currently, he is affiliated at the Research Institute for Tropical Medicine at Muntinlupa City. So today, he's going to share with us about data interpretation and presentation. So, Jonathan?
All right. Thank you. So once again, sorry. Yeah. What do we mean when we say data interpretation? So it means we make sense of our data by providing meaning in relation to your study. So we are trying to bridge the gap between your objective and your findings to draw conclusion. So we do this by making inferences, or in a creative way of saying it, we are trying to make a story out of it, out of your data. Because your data uh, should of course tell something about or try to address your objectives. So that's what it means by data interpretation. So it is important to do this to identify and explain the data. We do not just simply describe the data by saying, for example, this is the mean, this is the standard deviation, etc., etc. This is what we see in this picture. But we also explain uh, why certain things happen. Why do we have this finding? We also need comparison and contrast of data, and we we elucidate outliers in our data and what does it mean in relation to your objectives. And lastly, interpretation can also help by through extrapolation or making predictions. So those are the importance of data interpretation. So how do we interpret qualitative data? From the name itself, qualitative, we can say that the interpretation is subjective, mainly because we base it on observation, we base it on documentation, say survey of, of the perception of people to certain things, like for example, COVID-19 testing, example. Observation in the photographs we have taken, probably um, what we see under the microscope, as an example, or what we see with the naked eye. So to give you an example, here's a study from the Philippine Journal of Science from one of my former colleagues in the PLB, focusing on characterization of plant growth promoting diazotrophic bacteria from cacao. So in this figure, okay, let's try to focus it. So it's kind of pixelated, I guess. So in this data, um, certain bacterial isolates were screened for phosphate solubilization activity in a certain media called Picobscaya's medium. Okay, with a certain incubation parameters. So, as indicated in the caption, uh, no clearing from isolate means no activity or no phosphate solubilization. If there's an activity, if there's clearing, it means that there is phosphate solubilization. So by having this data, we observe that there are clearing, okay, the phosphate the phosphate in the image are solubilized by the bacteria. What does it mean? So it means that the isolates being studied can promote growth in plants through solubilization of phosphate in soil. So as you see, we we base our interpretation not just only in the topic or the title of the topic per se, but also what this study is trying to find out. So we make logical statements in interpretation. So this is just an example of a quality of interpreting a qualitative data. Of course, there are various types of qualitative data, and um, we make interpretations based on what is also indicated in our methods. So that would tell us what our qualitative data means. But how about in quantitative data? And most of us, I guess, most of our mentees, I guess, have focuses on uh, gathered quantitative data now. So for quantitative data, we interpret it based on descriptive and inferential statistics. So when we say descriptive, we focus on the mean, standard deviation, or frequency distribution. And for inferential, we focus on significant differences if we are indeed making comparison or we are trying to see contrast in our data or in two variables. Significant association or relationships if one increases or decreases as another increases or decreases, etc. So,
Jonathan?
for example, yes, hello,
Yeah,
yes,
it's
pa.
Carmel here. But basically, ano to, siguro just to, for the benefit of some of their students. Bale, parang with your last slide, I think it's important na sabihin natin yung difference no absolute difference and then of course yung relative difference. Meaning, dito dun sa part na sinabi mo about inferential data or interpretation, pag sinabi nating significant difference, ibig sabihin, kunyari, we have an observation na one, dun sa picture mo kanina, let's say, merong two, let's say, 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, tapos 1 plus 1, let's say, is equal, 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. So yung tinatawag natin na absolute difference is 2 and 3, di ba? So meaning, kapag meron
Yes,
kang results na, katulad dun sa iyong picture kanina na 2 out of the 3 tablets parang ano to yung lumaki yung area of clearing, diba? Diba? So parang ang
area
sinasabi
clearing.
natin dito na okay, may difference na na-observe tayo. Kasi yung isa parang two tablets, yung isa yung sa figure na to, let's say 3 out of 3 tablets, nakikita mo talaga it cleared yung area. Doon sa figure
Yes,
B, parang di ka sure dun sa isa, pero parang yung dalawa, 2 out of the 3, parang may clearing talaga siya. So, figure B, 2, tapos figure C, 3. Figure A, no clearing at all. So, makikita natin
yes,
yung
sir.
absolute difference. Okay, 2 versus 3. Pero ang dun sa next
And
slide mo, parang ang sinasabi natin dito, yung difference ba between 2 or 3, is it a real difference? So, yun yung parang
different.
pinag-uusap, yung mention mo na, is this a significant difference? Kasi by the numbers, by the absolute
Right.
numbers, parang magkaiba. Pero pagka naglagay na tayo nung tinatawag yung sinabi mo na data interpretation, if we are trying to make sense of the data, ang question dito, totoo nga bang magkaiba? 2 versus 3, totoo nga bang may significant difference? Tapos yung sinabi mo din na significant association, okay, parang ang sinasabi,
Association.
yes, parang sinasabi natin dito, okay, nag-clear yung surroundings, pero sure ba tayo na dahil nag-clear siya, ay talaga bang parang ano yun, nagkaroon talaga ng reaction. So, yung degree of the difference will tell us, uy,
Different.
talaga bang may effect? Parang ganon. So, yun lang, parang just to put it simply for our students,
Simply.
kasi nung high school
Student.
ako, hindi ko din alam, yung nung college din ako, hindi ko din alam yung mga absolute difference at significant difference. But yeah, just for the benefit of our students.
And in connection with that now, when we focus on significant and differences in association, we are also dealing with a lot of samples na a lot of population na kumbaga, di ba, Ma'am Carmela? Am I correct?
Yes.
To
Eto,
see
parang,
if things
yeah.
are true. Correct. Yes, Ma'am Carmela, hello?
No, please go ahead, yes.
Ah, all right. All right. Thank you, Ma'am Carmela, for that input pala, ma'am. Okay. Ayun. So, to proceed now, here's an example of a quantitative data from a study on platelet activation determines the severity of thrombocytopenia in the infection. Um, in this data, we are trying to focus on two variables. We have the platelet count of patients and dengue patients. The days here means yung days after na nagsimula nagkaroon ng sintomas ang pasyente. So these dots indicates ito yung mga data ninyo per day, per patient. So okay, so plate number were measured from freshly isolated blood samples of 10 patients. And there are also statistical notes here. As you can see, may mga asterisks tayo indicating, ito na yung sinasabi nating significant differences. Okay. So, the triple asterisk, for instance, indicates the p-value is less than 0.003. Meaning to say, for example, in day 4, it is significantly different in day 10. So, having these data, ano ibig sabihin nito? Okay, mas mababa sa day 4 ang platelet count compared sa day 10. Ganon din sa day 6. Pero hindi significantly different ang platelet count natin sa day 8 and day 10. When we say hindi significantly different, they are of the same level. As you can see may mga data points tayo na nag-overlap na halos no in 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 day 8 and in day 10. Halos hindi na siya nagkakalayo. So what does this mean? So platelet count of dengue patients drastically drops at the onset of the disease. Onset, yung simula ng pagpapakita ng sintomas ng disease, which eventually recovers back to normal 10 days after. To simply put it, no, although some would simply describe it like mas mababa si day 4 compared kay day 10, mas mababa kay day 6 kay day 10. But it's just simply described. So, napakahalaga dito guys na nagfo-focus tayo on what variables we are trying to study. Okay, for instance, ito, platelet count and dengue patients. They n days or number of days after the disease occurred. And what do these data points mean? So another example with the same study ulit tayo. For significant association naman to, no? Or establishing relationship. So here is a correlational analysis between platelet count and uh, platelet activation markers. So yung mga nasa y-axis natin, no? Let me just focus it. Okay, for instance, sa letter A, P-selectin as one of the platelet activation markers. So, if we are to check the data, ang pag mababa ang platelet count, yung data points natin for P-selectin ay matataas. Pero pag mataas na ang platelet count, mababa naman ang P-selectin or platelet activation marker natin. Which is true to all, no? And as you notice, yung correlation coefficient niya or the R value niya is negative. All of these data have negative correlation coefficient. What does this mean? So, even without focusing on the correlation coefficient, the mere fact na makakita ka ng trend in association studies, no? It means na if one variable, for example, platelet count is increasing, the other is decreasing, and vice versa. So what does this data mean? Okay, considering that mataas ang platelet activation markers, pag mababa ang platelet activation markers elevate and can be considered as indicator ng thrombocytopenia, in severity of thrombocytopenia, or the drastic drop of platelet count in dengue infection. And in the larger perspective, they can also indicate na may dengue infection.
Jonathan, explain, ano ko lang din, no,
Yes.
i-break down ulit natin para sa mga students.
Yes.
So, kasi minsan mahirap i-interpret yung mga ganitong graph. So, as you've said, okay, as you've said, yung pag tinignan mo tong graph na ito, meron tayong x-axis, which is the horizontal line, tapos yung ating y-axis na yung tinatawag natin yung PAC binding. Ayan. So, ibig sabihin, bawat isang dot na nakikita natin dito ay isang pasyente, no? Tapos meron ditong color code. So, yung mga red dots ay dengue patients, tapos ang mga white dot ay mga healthy patients. So, ngayon, ibig sabihin, yung katulad ng sinabi ni Jonathan, pagka based on the x-axis, kapag mababa ang platelet count, mataas ang kanyang, parang dito, yung mga dengue patients, makikita mo, yung maraming mga dots nandito sa simula, nasa first few area, yung nasa area ng malapit sa 50. So, ibig sabihin, mababang platelet count, let's say, of 50, ang 50 na platelet count, ibig sabihin yung pasyente talagang nagbe-bleed na ito. Parang konting masagi mo lang na nagbe-bleed na yaan talaga. So, ibig sabihin ito, mababa ang kanyang, mataas, yung binding, PAC binding ay mababa din, no? Ay mataas, this one. So inverse correlation. So
Mataas.
ibig sabihin,
Yes.
mataas. So inverse correlation. Ibig sabihin, sa correlation study, bawat isang data point, magkakaroon ka ngayon ng yung parang diagonal line na ito. Kapag mas maraming mga dots yung malapit dun sa diagonal line, in a way, ang pwede mong sabihin sa iyong data is merong kang nakikitang trend ng parang correlation. Ibig sabihin, related ba yung x-axis at saka y-axis? So, ibig sabihin, dito sa kanyang graph, sa graph na pinapakita ni Jonathan, ang pinapakita nitong correlation ibig sabihin yung tinatawag na inverse correlation, yung katulad ng sinabi niya, negative lahat. Ibig sabihin, yung x, pag habang tumataas si x-axis, habang bumababa ang x-axis, tumataas yung y-axis. So, yun yung parang inverse correlation. So, ibig sabihin, opposite, no? Pero, kapag nakakita ka ng ganitong graph, tapos lahat ng mga dots ay malayo dun sa iyong diagonal line, ang parang magiging interpretation nun ay, parang hindi ka magkakaroon ng correlation kasi magkakaiba yung values mo, masyadong magkakalayo yung values mo. Kasi itong diagonal line na to, para siyang para siyang yung average ng lahat, parang ganon. So dito sa apat na graph na ito, makikita natin lahat ng mga dots lumalapit dun sa diagonal line. Ibig sabihin, parang parang similar yung nakikita nating pattern. May nakikita tayong pattern. Kapag yung mga dots ay magkakalayo, malayo dun sa diagonal line, ibig sabihin parang walang pattern. Pero ito, parang may pattern. So yung pattern na nakikita natin is, yun yung tinatawag natin na correlation analysis. Ang ngayon, tatanungin mo, positive correlation o negative correlation? Parang dito, ang parang masasabi natin ay para siyang negative correlation. Parang ganun ang interpretation ng data na ito, no? Jonathan, please correct me kung tama ba ang ating yung negative or positive correlation ito.
Yes, correct po, ma'am. If, since clearly naman, if clearly din sa patterns natin and sa trends natin na at a higher platelet count of a higher value of x-axis, mababa si y-axis. And pag mababa si x-axis, marami tayong data points sa y-axis na mataas. Yan, which connotes negative correlation. So these are just to give you examples of how we interpret data na we analyze using inferential statistics, showing either significant differences and significant associations or correlation in this matter. So, question to ask for interpreting data. Una, ayun, what variables did these data focus on? So, for example, in this data, so the variables na pinag-aralan natin is the dengue patients, the dengue patients days after kung kailan nagsimula yung sintomas, tsaka yung platelet count. Also considering yung healthy individuals. The next is, what do these outcomes mean? Anong ibig sabihin ng findings natin? And what could be the logic behind these data as we describe it in our examples? And what objective does this data is trying to address? In order to relate yung findings natin with our objectives. Common problems in data interpretation. So um, before nung mga undergrad pa ako, or even high school, no, these are just some of the common mistakes or problems that I encountered then as I did the research before. For instance, ito, interpretation is does not mean description. Ano bang pinagkaiba ng interpretation and description aside from spelling or number of words? Pag sinabi natin interpretation yan, we go back to our meaning of interpretation, making sense of the data. We provide meaning. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng data na to sa topic mo? But when we say describing the data, we simply say, for example, ito, nakita ko to, may clearing dito sa isolator to. That is describing because this is what we see. Or for example, on the average, ito ang platelet count ng mga pasyente 4 days after na nagpakita ng symptoms. So that is describing. But I'm not saying in writing the results in discussion, no, we do not describe our data. It's just that we cannot equate description of the data with interpretation. Irrelevant data. I hope not everyone was able to encounter irrelevant data, no, since we are well guided din naman by our mentors. But there are cases in my experience then, no, na yes, we were able to gather the data, we were able to interpret it, but were we able to connect it with our objectives to address them well? Next is correlation and causation. Correlation, as we have seen in our example, kumbaga may connection ba ang dalawang variables. But there are instances na yung correlation, hindi ibig sabihin nun yung isang variable natin ay may logical connection with the another variable. So in our example, may logical connection kasi these variables in the y-axis as described here, no, are platelet activation markers. And we are trying to study the other variable, which is platelet count. So, may possible logic behind it. Pero there are instances na wala. Say, for example, number of TV versus ilang beses sa isang araw kumakain. Di ba walang connect? Walang logic. Yes, we may be able to draw something out of it. We may be able to make correlation, or we may be able to find out or to to come up with a correlation. Pero walang logic there. But correlation can also be a good basis or a good baseline for studying causation. And lastly, confirmation bias. When we say confirmation bias, we have certain expectations already in our study. May be positive, Of course, positive result or expected result. Let's say. And we tailor yung interpretation natin in a way na um, uh, we tailor or we make our interpretation in a way na mag magtutunog na parang ito na yung na-gather nating data yun din ang expected result natin. So there are certain biases. And this may also mean na meron kang binaya. So that is confirmation bias, for instance. So before we move pala to the other topic, are there any questions regarding data interpretation? Or probably maybe after the presentation, we could tackle these questions. Okay. How about data presentation? It's not just simply showing our data, but it means an organization of your findings in a logical, sequential, and substantial manner. Kailangan, in scientific writing, kailangan maayos nating ma-present yung data natin in a way na hindi lang siya makaka-create ng interest sa ating readers. Readers may to mentors, of course. But also, it should allow readers na maintindihan yung data itself na kung anong ibig sabihin noon. So showing data in summarized form, concise and compact, pero hindi dapat siya nagkukulang sa details. So that is data presentation. So there are three ways we can present our data. So we have textual, tabular, and graphical. So for textual, it's straightforward. It's describing the findings, emphasizing the significant figures, identifying important features of the data. So when we say textual, it can be a phrase or sentences. And most of the time, and textual presentation is included in the results portion of the results and discussion. So we simply describe the data here. So that's textual presentation. How about tabular presentation? Tabular, from the name per se, make use of tables, and it is a systematic organization of findings and rows and columns to illustrate relationships or the comparison between among two or more variables, or to simply show lists. So these are the parts of a tabular data presentation. So we have the title, the body, of course, and the footnotes. So for the title, it is a always and always nasa taas siya. Hindi dapat siya nasa footnotes. So in scientific writing now, we indicate table, then followed by a number, kung pang ilang table ba siya, then the title of the data itself in tabular form. So sa title, dapat dinedescribe na natin it should be able to describe the data being shown in the body. So for example, ito, characteristics on the prospective cohort in Punta Princesa, Cebu City, Philippines, March 12 to March 2030. So Ito yung characteristics na pinofocus niya. And ito yung mismong numbers or the data itself. Sa body, as you notice, no, um, it is best na hindi na may mga horizontal lines lang siya to divide, for example, this portion, the upper portion, showing ano bang mga parameters dito and the specifics are here. Mas malinis siyang tignan compared if lahat ay naka-all borders. And in most of the scientific articles I've encountered, no, ganito nila pinapresent kasi mas malinis. Mas readable siya. Footnotes, if you have some, yeah, from the name per se, no? If you have some notes in the data, for example, itong sa participants who completed the study, so participants, etc., we put it in footnotes and normally, mas maliit ang text niya. Why? Kasi ang main focus natin, the title and the data itself. So, that's how we present in tabular form. And lastly, and common way of presenting our data is graphical presentation. It's more visual compared to that tabular. Although tabular is, yeah, it's systematic, but graphical presentation is more visual and can easily attract attention to the readers or audiences. It can be a picture or a photo, as you have seen in the earlier slides, diagrams, or charts, graphs like bar graph, line graph, and scatter graph, or even pie chart. Excuse me. So in a graphical data presentation, of course, we have the data or the body itself, and the caption. Hindi we it is a good practice na the title of our, let's say, graphical data we present is in the caption. Ayan. So, may so we put the caption as figure, tapos number kung pang ilan siyang figure sa data mo. So, and then the title itself. Effects of, in this case, effects of water and methanolic extract, etc. And also, nilalagay din natin dito yung footnotes. So, title of the data. Of course, in diagrams and in photos, or even in charts, no, importante ang labels. It should be big enough to indicate the data, but not big enough to overwhelm but not big enough to overwhelm the data itself. All right. So that is for diagrams, for photos and diagrams. For charts, example, bar graphs. So we have legends. Kumbaga, ano yung ini-indicate ng ganitong kulay or ganitong picture. Then, of course, y-axis and x-axis titles. So, binabase natin to sa variables we are trying to start. In terms of x and y-axis titles, we base it on the x-axis. We base it on the independent variable we are trying being studied. Well, si y-axis, si dependent variable. There are also y-axis and x-axis graduations, or there are instances na si x-axis instead of graduations, labels naman. Just like what we encountered in one of our previous in our previous slides. Ito, labels, ayan. Whereas graduations, ito,
Jonathan, we're not
and
able to see your screen.
ang sorry.
Um, we are not able to see your screen.
I think you stopped sharing it, so you can click the share button again.
Yeah. Alright. Ayan. Alright. So going back, um, this is an example in our previous slides. Ayan. There are cases na si x-axis natin, the x-axis are labels instead of graduations, such as in this portion. And there are also x-axis na graduations as in numbers. And mostly makikita natin yung x-axis graduations in linear graphs and scatter plot. Scatter plot, such as the previous data that I've shown, na marami tayong dots in the data, no? And we have the trend line. So those are the parts of yung ating graphs, no? And it is important part dito. Malinaw yung data labels natin. It's big enough, but not big enough to overwhelm the axis titles. And of course, kailangan indicated din natin yung legends. Although in Excel, no, meron tayong chart title, but when we write for publication, we indicate, again, let me reiterate na we indicate the title sa ating caption. Figure, number, then the title. So, common problems it's data presentation. So, number one, presenting irrelevant data. Uh, Maybe just to try to overwhelm or try to impress our readers, no? We just simply put some data there, even without any relation, just to show na we have some outcomes. No? So we should try to avoid that. Presenting a portion of your data set only. Kumbaga may tinatago ka pa. Just to make it, kumbaga, I don't know, maybe to make uh, to to make the study look better, no? So in publication, we disclose our data. For choice of data presentation type, uh, yung let's say yung tinable mo pwede mong i-graph. And mostly ang na-encounter kong problem din is that uh, yung mga data na may inferential statistic, no, tinatable siya. Yung may mga SD and may significant differences. They can be presented in better in bar graphs compared kung itatable mo yan. Kasi again, we should put it into perspective of a reader na mas interested siya on visual aid or what on pictures rather than on numbers on numbers. Combining more than one data presentation together. It would not be a problem if we combine textual with tabular and graphical. Kasi ganun talaga. So we describe, wika ko nga kanina, we describe as part of discussing the result, we describe the data. So textual presentation. We describe the graph, we describe the photo, we describe the table. Kailan nagiging problematic? If in case, halimbawa, nag-bar graph ka na, may line graph ka pa. So, it doesn't make sense. It is redundant, kumbaga. So, another is presenting the same piece of data more than once. I know napapahaba ang ating discussion sa ating data, and as we write, no, there are instances na yung data mo is on the first page of the results and discussion, then this then when you describe your data, umabot ka na sa second page. And iisipin mo, i-incorporate ko kaya ulit yung data na ito or yung graph na ito para hindi na pabalik-balik yung data. That's a big no. Pag na-present mo na siya on one page, doon lang siya. Do not repeat it to avoid redundancy. Unnecessary labels. Unnecessary labels, for example, if in this graph, may data label ka pa, kumbaga may value ka pa nitong light blue na ito, and may mean and standard deviation ka pang in-indicate. Kumbaga nakaka-crowd siya sa graph, kumbaga. Kung pwede namang visually, makita na ng reader na ito yung more or less ito na yung value niya. Kasi meron ka namang indicators. May graduations ka naman. And lack of appropriate labels. Halimbawa, appropriate labels, halimbawa itong sa x-axis, sa y-axis, wala kang nilagay. So, are there any questions regarding data interpretation and presentation? Or perhaps I would appreciate it if there are more inputs about this topic.
Okay, so does anyone have question for Jonathan? Especially our mentees?
I guess earlier you mentioned. I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes,
Yes,
continue,
go
continue.
ahead.
You mentioned like yung um presenting irrelevant data. So it's like, how would you classify yung relevance ng data? Like, even if it just affects it like a little bit, should you put that in the first part or the second part? I don't know. Is there like a hierarchy in the placement when it comes to the relevance of the data? Does that make sense? The question.
Yes, it makes sense. It makes sense actually. Uh, in terms of placement, no, ano ba, tinitignan natin kung yung data ba to may sinasagot ba tong objective na to? That's number one question in terms of relevance. Number two, if it does, no, um, we base the order of our presenting our data sa kung anong objective yung una nating ina-address. As you would notice in research articles, ganon, may let's say is it chronological or logical order that pinafollow. Kasi first objective, okay, ito. Or if hindi man tahasan sinasabi ng study, in enumerated form yung objective nila, at least based on their methods, no, may logic kung ano yung mauuna. Ano ba una mong ginawa? Tapos ano yung data dito? So ito yung mauuna. Then the next one and the next one. So yun yung mga tinitingnan natin in terms of data relevance.
Jonathan, if you'll allow me, parang
Yes.
gusto ko i-expand yung iyong answer kasi I completely support yung iyong answer about determining which is relevant data or not. At ito,
Yes,
babalik tayo dun sa unang, yung siguro one of our first few lectures, it has to be, katulad ng sinabi mo, it has to tie up with your objectives. So kaya
Yes.
tayo merong general objective or yung main objective nung iyong research. Kaya natin sinasabi na dapat mag-focus ka sa isang key problem or main question that you want to solve or main objective kasi yun yung magde-determine ano yung iyong relevant information. So,
Yes.
tama yung sinabi ni Jonathan, yung pag pinresent mo yan, first of all, ita-tie up mo siya dun sa iyong objectives.
Yes.
Yung pinaka-importanting objective, yun yung graph or yun yung table na dapat nandun sa iyong parang kumbaga main paper. So sa mga journals, kapag magpe-present tayo, o kaya sa mga conferences, usually may limit sila na binibigay o less sasabihin nila, for your manuscript or for your presentation, you're only allowed 4 figures and tables. All the rest, nasa supplementary date, nasa supplementary part ng iyong manuscript. So, kung meron kang presentation na, let's say, 10 minutes presentation, tapos limited ka lang sa, let's say, 4 figures and tables, paano mo pipiliin based sa iyong objectives at saka yung pinaka-importanting results. So, yun yung mauuna na iprepresent mo. With regards to the sequence or yung hierarchy, merong katulad nung sinabi ni Jonathan, may usual pattern. So, ibig sabihin, first of all, usually, i-describe mo muna yung, let's say, yung mga figures, yung but tinatawag natin na study design o yung methodology mo, present mo doon. Tapos, yung iyong, kung ano yung target population na inaral mo, let's say, kunyari, dengue patients, ano yung kanilang tinatawag na basic characteristic ng population na inaral mo. And then, usually, sa mga research, lalo na sa mga quantitative research o kahit sa mga survey, meron tayong tinatawag na, yung parang tinatawag na what we call consort diagram. Dito pinapakita mo yung, let's say, kunyari nag-survey ka. Nag-survey ka ng 50 people. Pero among the 50 people, let's say, 5 hindi kompleto ang sinagot. Tapos, yung, di may 45 ka na lang ngayon na tao na meron kang complete. Out of the 45, meron palang 2 tao na 2 beses niyang sinagot ang survey. So, in the end, let's say, kaka-filter out mo niyan, let's say, out of the 50 people na sinurvey mo, yung talagang pwede mo lang na i-analyze na results ay, let's say, 30 people. Sa iyong presentation ng iyong results, ipapakita mo yung kung meron kang diagram na ipapakita how you selected the data points that you analyzed. So, ibig sabihin nun, that is one way of also looking at what is relevant and irrelevant data. Yung relevant data, ito yung mga aspects or mga data points na kinulet mo na ito it will matter or it will impact directly your objectives or the things that you wanted to measure. Pero it is true na meron ka sigurong mga extra data na na-collect na can further describe a little bit or clarify a little bit more yung nakuha mong main results. It is probably hindi siya yung iyong main data, pero it's a supporting data. Kailangan ito pwede mo pa rin siyang i-present, pero supplementary, kumbaga add-on, di ba? Pero wag din natin kakalimutan na yung binanggit ni Jonathan kanina, very, very important, yung confirmation bias. Minsan, tayo bilang mga researchers, may in-expect ka na result, tapos hindi yun ang nakuha mo. Sometimes, even more important to present yung negative results, which may be perceived as irrelevant at first glance, pero pag nagkaroon ka ng negative result, very different from what you are expecting, dito ka dapat mag-careful. Titingnan mo lahat ngayon yung data mo kasi kailangan mong intindihin bakit magkaiba yung result na nakuha mo sa ine-expect mo. So, ibig sabihin, hindi, yung mga tinatawag natin minsan na irrelevant data, minsan ito, ang attitude natin dito, hindi naman dapat na, wag na nating ipakita ito or wag na nating yan. Pero, you need to always tie up, kailangan mong balikan yung objective mo, kailangan mong balikan yung the way you analyze your data. Tapos dun mo ngayon makikita, okay, ito ba talaga relevant or irrelevant data? Kung na-label mo siya na irrelevant, hindi ibig sabihin that you don't need to show it. You may potentially show it, pero parang secondary. So, yon.
Thank you, Ms. Carmela. Are there other questions regarding data interpretation and presentation?
Okay, so do you have
Oh,
any more
by the way,
questions? Okay. Yes, Jonathan.
yes, sorry, John. By the way, since Ma'am Carmela mentioned about presenting, I think non-verbatim you said presenting data in audiences. What I just presented, what I just showed you is how to present in written form yung sa ating data presentation. But of course, yeah, thank you, Ma'am Carmela, for mentioning presenting data naman in, for example, conferences or as in presentation. Yes, John, sorry.
Yeah. So, do you guys have any more question for Jonathan? Okay. So anyway, if you have more questions about data interpretation and presentation, you can always probably send Jonathan a message.